Welcome everyone. My name is Jackie and I work at the Ann Arbor District Library in the Outreach Department. Thank you for joining us this evening. I just want to go over one housekeeping thing before we get started. This program is recorded and live streamed. So we're asking that questions be held till the end of the program, and I will carry around the mic to take any questions at the end of the event if there are any. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Garrett Schumann to the stage for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, everyone joining us here in person and on the stream and at different points in time through the archived video. As Jackie said, my name is Dr. Garrett Schumann. I'm a composer and a scholar and a music writer, and I teach at the University of Michigan and various music-related courses. And I'm a long-standing presenter at the library, so this is my 5th presentation since 2019, and I'm very excited to share it with you. Other things that I've done that are about research have been an opportunity for me to share things that I've studied for the first time. This is very exciting because I have published recently on this topic, and now I get the opportunity to synthesize what I've found and share it with you. And before I begin, I just want to thank the library for hosting us, the wonderful tech support, and again, everyone who's here and watching whenever that is happening. So I want to talk a little bit about my background on this topic and how I approach it. This presentation will be about artificial intelligence technologies used with music, particularly in the experimental side of classical music, but I'm going to talk about other kinds of music as well. And I want to be clear that I'm not a computer scientist. I understand how the technology works, but I don't have technical expertise. I mentioned I published on this topic before, and you may be wondering how, and where I published helps explain that a little bit. The first piece that I wrote on this topic was for the New York Times, and it was published in June. You can see the difference between the online headline and the print headline. I don't write those. And the second thing that I published was for Chamber Music Magazine, which is a trade magazine published by the nonprofit Chamber Music America. It's a really wonderful magazine, but you may have seen, or you can read my New York Times article. You would have trouble tracking down the Chamber Music Magazine one. But for this work, I talked to a lot of experts, subject matter experts, composers who work with this technology. I'm going to share a lot of their words, and I'm going to share their work in the following presentation. And here's a list of some of the people I talked to who we'll hear from today. And to get started, what I wanted to do is read the introduction to my piece in Chamber Music Magazine, which is a timeline, a history of this kind of technology used by composers and in the classical music space. I will end up reading this quote, which is an interesting quote to me. This was a review. This is from a review published in the Chicago Daily Tribune in 1959 of a piece called Iliac Suite, which is considered the first computer-generated composition. So in 1956, these two faculty members at the University of Illinois programmed a supercomputer on campus to generate notated music, or generate information they interpreted and translated into a piece of music for a string quartet. And this author, William D. Hanson, attended a performance a few years later, and I find it interesting that his more abstract thoughts about the implications of technology are pretty similar to things we're thinking about today with what AI can and will do in a more societal context. And of course, this relates to music. But to sort of set the stage and frame my perspective on the topic, I'm going to read you something I wrote in August. It was called A Brief History of AI and Classical Music by me. Composers have been using tools and techniques that fall under the umbrella of what we call artificial intelligence since the late 1950s. Although sometimes seen as monolithic, applications of AI in music involve and combine many different processes, ranging from algorithmic systems to neural networks. This distinctive technological history is closely related not only to other 20th century developments in electronic music, but also to the much older practice of using rules-based systems to create new works. Legeren Hiller and Leonard Isaacson's computer-generated string quartet Iliac Suite from 1956 emerged at the same time that other composers, including John Cage and Ioannis Xenakis, manually applied sophisticated mathematical procedures to their compositional processes. Even the musical dice games of 18th century Europe may be seen as a distant forebearer of this procedurally generated music that composers have produced with computers from the middle of the 20th century onward. If the connection between artificial intelligence and music is older than we might think, then so are questions and concerns about the creative authenticity of this technology's manual applications. In 1959, William D. Hanson of the Chicago Daily Tribune responded to Iliac Suite with an op-ed titled, "This is Music?" in which he worried, little by little, it seems, electronic brains are taking over. And while human composers are not yet in jeopardy, the cards are on the table. From Iliac Suite forward, this timeline illustrates the development of different types of artificial intelligence. Technology is related to classical music during the last 66 years. We can see consistent advancements in terms of composition in the forms of musical analysis and computer-generated music, as well as in performance in terms of sound synthesis and real-time interactivity. The current era of AI music tools distinguishes it itself by their increased computational power, speed, and flexibility, especially in interactive, real-time, and live performance applications. In the last decade, corporations and other powerful institutions have invested more resources in and exerted more influence upon the development of AI music tools than ever before, making it difficult for individual musicians to experiment independently with this technology. Similarly concerning are the highly extractive practices common to recent AI music programs, whose training scrapes enormous amounts of audio from websites such as YouTube without permission from the creators. The past few years have been marked by the arrival of new free-to-use AI music tools, such as Google's Music LM and SingSong, as well as the startup releases Wave Tool and UberDuck. Unfortunately, some of these new programs quickly gained an ignoble notoriety as anonymous users have impersonated and exploited the celebrity of popular, primarily African American musicians. In classical music, AI continues to appear most commonly in custom-designed, specialized projects, many of which consider, if not directly confront, these ethical issues. Nevertheless, the worry William D. Hanson expressed in 1959 remains relevant. This is a quote from my New York Times article, "Tina Talon Teaches at the University of Florida." And this is just a nice summary of the overall technological development. So recent things or public-facing things like ChatGPT or something like that, those are programs that use machine learning, which is a relatively recent development in the technology from like the 1990s. It's important to see a continuity with other historical practices, and like in what I just read, practices that were similarly minded but not using the same hardware, like using advanced math in a different application than through a computer. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through some of the history from that first work that I mentioned a couple times, Iliac Suite from 1956, and then get to some cases in the current situation of AI, and so like examples of recent works that use it in interesting ways. As we talk about different applications of the technology, I think it's useful to consider the different functionalities that the particular tools we discuss are attempting to achieve. So you see, I broke it down into these 4 categories. There is a lot of overlap between them, but I think these cover sort of all the different paths that the people I've talked to and have researched follow when they use this kind of technology. So we have programmable music generation, which is particularly important in the earliest stages of this technology's development because it was basically the only thing the computers could do. So that would be using sophisticated algorithms to produce notated music or information that could be translated into notated music, what was used with Iliac Suite. And sound synthesis, this, in the late 20th century, sound synthesis developed rapidly in a lot of different areas, and certainly with AI. And this is one of the ways that AI is used in musical performance. Analysis, which doesn't necessarily mean like analyzing pieces of music, although you could use it to do that, like as a music theorist. But when we talk about machine learning, the basic process of machine learning is giving the software an input with music. It's usually audio, but it can be something else, like representations of notated music. And then the software breaks it down, identifies patterns, and uses that analysis to then reconstruct and generate what seems to be new material, it is new, but the originality of it, I guess, is in question. And then the last point is interactivity. And as particularly from the late 1980s onward, as computers became more powerful, it became more possible to play with interactivity in interesting ways. And one of the composers whose music I will share later, George E. Lewis, who teaches at Columbia University, is particularly important in that area. Okay. So we have Iliac Suite here. This is the piece that I mentioned before. This is an example of programmable music generation. This other piece, there's an interesting quote from the composer Laurie Spiegel, who's responsible for the second piece I mentioned here from 1980, the harmonic algorithm. Her goal with this piece was to achieve immortality as a composer. And I'll read this quote from her because it's very evocative. If instead of composing individual finite length works, a composer could encode in computer software their personal compositional methods, preferences, processes, and ways of making musical decisions, then they could go on composing and generating new music long after the biological human had ceased to exist. I think that's an interesting way of thinking about the utility of technology like this for a composer, expanding the corporality. In terms of sound synthesis, here are 2 examples. Essentially what I'm doing with this part of the presentation is giving you a couple examples of each of these categories from before the current time. So this first piece is by a composer named Todd Mackover, and the AI component is he developed this thing he calls the hyper instrument for this opera. He developed this as an important institute called IRCAM. It's in France. It's subsidized by the French government. It's called the Institute for the Research and Research and Creativity with Acoustics and Music. So it's artistic and it's scientific. And one of the later technologies we're going to talk about was also developed there. And one of the other pieces we're going to talk about was premiered there. This other piece from 2006, Time Lapse, this is an interesting work by R. Luc Dubois. He used a machine learning program to analyze the timbre of every #1 Billboard song from like 1956 to 2006, and then perform just the timbre. So when I say timbre, I'm talking about like the sound of the instruments, but disassociated from the instruments. So it's kind of ambient sonic impression of these popular songs. And he used a machine learning program to do that. That would be analysis and sound synthesis because it produced new sounds based on the analysis of the audio from the examples that he fed into it. In terms of analysis, this first work, Experiments in Musical Intelligence, which is actually a book, is the most important, one of the most important of any of these examples, because this is where the process for using machine learning with music was pioneered, essentially. David Cope is I believe he teaches at UC Davis, and he conceived a process with 6 steps, which is similar to what I described before. Input, analysis, pattern matching, deconstruction, reconstruction, output. And this is the basic premise for audio or music-based machine learning. It has been for almost 30 years. And when we talk about, we'll listen to some examples of machine learning things. That's what it does. It takes in the signal. It all works the same way. Taking the signal, breaking it down, identifying patterns, and then figuring out how to reconstruct using the characteristics of the patterns. This other piece, like I said, there's some overlap. So continuator is primarily an analysis program, but it happens in real time, so it's interactive. There are videos you can see of this, of like jazz pianists improvising and then a piano being controlled by this program, learning their style and playing along with them, and it's pretty amazing. And there's similar things. There are other applications as well, but primarily this, we're going to talk about something kind of similar next, and the distinction between continuator and what we're going to talk about on the next slide, a piece called Voyager, is that this is really about analyzing and building off input from a human performer, which is slightly different from the next piece, Voyager, which is, along with David Cope's Experiments in Musical Intelligence, which is what pioneered machine learning with music, Voyager is a really landmark piece. George E. Lewis, this composer I mentioned before, who teaches at Columbia University, his background is, in addition to being trained as a composer, is as a jazz saxophonist. So he conceived this program, which he's continued to develop and iterate on over the last 36 years, as a sort of distinctive, interactive performance entity that would, similar to what I just described, listen to human performers and play things based on what they're playing, but also have its own presence where it makes decisions that aren't based on that. And we will hear a clip later in the presentation, or we'll watch really, because it's a video, of the most recent version of this program in practice. When he originally developed this in the late 1980s, the way it performed was there was a computer on stage with all the software, programmed not using machine learning at all, but only sophisticated algorithms. And it would play synthesized sounds, but from the late 1980s, so it really stood out timbrally in a performance with like acoustic instruments. A later notable use of this technology came in 2004 when he developed it for a piano concerto performance with the American Composers Orchestra at Carnegie Hall. So the same basic premise where software controlled the piano to be interactive, analytical, and also assertive in a live performance improvisation space. But this time, instead of using synthesized sounds, it used like a digitally controlled piano. And the most recent one, which we'll see a clip of, also uses a piano. So that helps with it helps to match the sound of what the computer is doing with what the people around it are doing, which it really sticks out with the original version of this. And when we'll hear some, we'll hear, and you'll hear me discuss some examples of very recent machine learning synthesis, and you'll be able to hear that it doesn't perfectly fit in with acoustic instruments, even though it's very powerful technology. Here's just, before I move on, here's a quote from Lewis about Voyager. He calls it a non-hierarchical musical environment that privileges improvisation. And I think it's very meaningful that he doesn't refer to it as an instrument, and he doesn't refer to it as anything else. He's very careful about his language because he wants it to exist sort of outside of the traditional ways of music making in classical music. So it's not an instrument, it's not something to do analysis, it's this entity, essentially, that performs music along with people. So in the current situation, like I said, we have, in the 21st century, we've had enormous leaps in terms of speed and computational power. And they've impacted the functionalities that we just talked about: programmable music generation, synthesis, analysis, interactivity in different ways. But particularly in the last few years, what we have is, for the first time, really visible, publicly visible artificial intelligence. So ChatGPT is not musical necessarily, but that is people, lots of people have heard about that. The bringing ChatGPT to the public was a big moment because it seemed very novel to have artificial intelligence at our fingertips interacting with it. It's important to think, though, that there has been a lot of diffusely used artificial intelligence prior to things like ChatGPT and its musical cousins, but maybe it's not as clear that it uses artificial intelligence. So if we're thinking about music in particular, there is music production software that's been commonly used since the late 1990s that uses artificial intelligence technology. If we think about listening to music, streaming apps use algorithms, just like the sophisticated algorithms and some of the things I told you about, I mean, similar in concept at least, to control and influence how we interact with them. So our experience as people engaging with music long before the arrival of things like ChatGPT and these other programs that are specifically music related, like Music LM by Google, our experience of music has been influenced by artificial intelligence for a long time. That's the point I'm trying to make. This is a quote from one of George E. Lewis's writings from 1995. And when I read the introduction to my piece in Chamber Music magazine, at one point I talked about the concerns over rampant institutional power when it comes to this technology. And what's interesting is that he is identifying the same thing but much earlier. So in the mid-90s, I'll just read the last sentence. Corporate power assumed and important, even dominating, corporate power, there's a typo, assumed an important. Corporate power assumed an important, even dominating role in conditioning our thinking about computers, art, image, and sound. When I interviewed him for my article in the New York Times, he told me a related story, an anecdote from an installation he was working on in the early 2000s that was supposed to be an interactive musical installation in like a public library or maybe a museum. And at one point in the process of working on this project, he learned that the means of interactivity that the audience would have with the piece was a mouse at a computer. And that really disappointed him because it's a limiting way that puts a lot of boundaries on how the interactivity could happen. And this is an example of what he's talking about, institutional domination of how we engage with these technologies. Because in order to make them, I guess, scalable in a business sense, needing to control the ways that we interact with them. And if you think about other the current age, we have the same problem where I've mentioned ChatGPT. There's a Google program that I've mentioned, Music LM, which is soon to be available. It's like available in a beta version. There's a startup program I mentioned called Wave Tool, which came out in the spring. That's something where these are all text-based. So it's similar to the mouse that George E. Lewis talked about, where you have, with these new public-facing programs, there's this idea of like, oh, music making, musical creativity can be accessible more than ever, but you have to put in text prompts, and that is a limiting form of interaction that shapes what people will make with it if those technologies ever come to fruition of being as publicly available as like ChatGPT. But they're also a symbol of the kind of domination that George E. Lewis was worried about back in the day. Robert Laidlaw is one of the composers I interviewed for the New York Times as well, and we'll hear some music from him as well as from George later in the talk. And he is a fellow at Oxford University, at Jesus College, Oxford University, and something he pointed out to me, and I'll talk more about his piece later, but in order to make it, the only way he could make it was being associated with that institution. And he pointed out, and I quoted this, and this was like the end of my article, basically saying that this technology has not made it out into the world in the sense that people who are not institutionally affiliated can use it. You can't just pick it up and do things with it. You have to partner with a large corporation in some way or be a part of a large institution that has access to the computation that you need. That runs a little bit contrary to the ease and availability of artificial intelligence as it's communicated to us, especially since January. So I feel like those quotes sort of set up this dichotomy when we're looking at the last few years of domination, like what George was writing about, and then experimentation, which is what the people using these tools are able to do that is still true to their musical and artistic vision and kind of resists the domination. And so that's kind of the setup I'm using here. To talk more about this concept of domination and how AI plays into it, this is a quote from one of my interview subjects for my New York Times article, Dr. Anongo Lumumba Kasango, who teaches at Brown University. She is a computer scientist professor. She's a computer scientist, a professor of music, and she's also a hip hop artist. And so she's written, prior to when I talked to her, she had written an article about impersonations of hip hop vocal performance, AI-generated impersonations of hip-hop vocal performance becoming popular on social media and the implications for that in that particular musical space. And I thought it had a lot to say about, I thought there were important implications for classical music too. Something that she identified is that, like she says here, I don't think it's a coincidence that hip-hop artistry is forming the testing ground for understanding how AI affects artists and their artistry. She points to the existing practices of exploiting Black musicians in popular music, so there's already a tradition of doing that, so it's not surprising that when this new tool is being incorporated into that field, that the tradition is continuing through it. I think there's also some technical reasons too, but what's interesting, I just saw an advertisement on Twitter like yesterday for a hologram performance by Maria Callas, the opera singer who died a long time ago. And it would not be surprising to see classical music performances or the attempt to revive dead classical musicians through artificial intelligence technology. And I think what Dr. Lumumba Kasango is talking about here, her characterization of these popular music works that experiment with impersonating existing musicians and known musicians as a testing ground, I think when we think about where would that practice extend, it would not surprise me at all if you had, AI-generated recordings of dead classical musicians or something like that. They probably already exist, and I don't know about them. I wanted to play an example of what Dr. Lumumba Kasongo was talking about. This is a AI vocal impersonation of two very famous musicians, The Weeknd, who is alive and a very famous popular musician, and Freddie Mercury, who is not alive, but obviously still a very famous popular musician. And here they are performing the hymn, How Great Thou Art. So we're going to listen to that. Just a couple minutes of it.
Oh Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the words thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thou power throughout the universe display. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. And when I think that God is unsparing, sent him to die, I scarce can take it in. That on the cross, my burden gladly bearing, he bled and died to take away my sins. And since my soul, my Savior God, to thee, how rise thou art.
Okay. They were going to come in together there. I think we should take a moment and think about where this all began in 1956. In order to, because there you can totally draw a line from the Iliac suite, the procedurally generated computer-powered piece where over a very long period of time of inputting programming, probably with punch cards, these two faculty members were able to get deliberately structured but musically unintelligible information that they then copied into sheet music that a string quartet was able to play. And from that point, 77 years later, 67 years later, sorry. So I said I'm not a technical expert. I can't do math in my head. We get this, not only is the vocal performance an AI-generated impersonation, I'm sure there's some webs, I imagine it was a lot easier to do than the Iliac suite was in terms of time. And also the imagery here is very clearly AI-generated imagery, so we have a double whammy of a multimedia AI-generated thing. I don't know about the backing track, not the instrumental, the non-singing parts. But it's very interesting how far the technology has come and what it means that not only is it more available, but it also is much it works very, very quickly. We're actually going to make a piece of AI music in a moment, and you'll see how quickly it works. But before we do that, I want to just reflect on how this connects to the quote from Dr. Lumumba Kasongo about using this technology to dominate a particular group of artists. I don't know about The Weeknd's personal religious practice. I know that Freddie Mercury, in addition to being dead and not agreeing to be participating in that, practiced Zoroastrianism, so he was not Christian. But the important thing that this kind of funny, bizarre example of the technology represents is the extractive qualities that are at the heart, particularly of the current generation. So large models like ChatGPT or Google Music LM just take raw input information without the consent of the creators. I mentioned this at the beginning of the paper. And so this was made, without these musicians' permission. The Weeknd was involved in a moment. There were some other songs, or there's a different song that caught more of an attention in April or May of this year that impersonated his voice as well as Drake, his vocal performance, and the Record Industry Association, whatever their professional organization is, actually took action about this and was like, these exist, but you can't make money off of this for a variety of reasons, to hopefully tamp it down. But you can still find these things, so they can't control it exactly. But it's really important to think about, especially when we start to look at these other examples of people trying to use this technology in a more ethical way, a more intentional way, a more customized way, something that the people I talk to, and even someone else who I've researched, who we're going to look at in a moment, they're really responding to the lack of consent that has gone into training these things, and they're very attuned to that. And that is not, I think there are a couple recent things. I know that President Biden released an executive order that I was not able to read earlier this week, targeting AI, and I think dealing with the issue of privacy. And I know earlier in the summer, towards the end of the summer, there was either some kind of petition or movement among authors who identified that their books had been used to train ChatGPT to maybe make a class action lawsuit or something against OpenAI because their copyrighted works were being used without permission. So experimentation. I've sort of set up this dichotomy. We have some examples of domination and the asymmetrical power dynamics, but still people who are currently active are trying to find new ways of using this technology and new ways of using it creatively with music and in a way that they feel comfortable with. So understanding the potential privacy or authorship issues and either leaning into them in our next example or trying to work around them in some of our other ones. So Holly Herndon is a composer and vocalist, and she, a couple years ago, she created a machine learning generated AI vocal model, or model of her singing voice. And in response to the prevalence, even at that point, of what she refers to as vocal deepfakes, so the kind of AI-generated impersonations of particular singers, she decided that she was going to produce this AI model of her voice and make it available to anyone. So instead of trying to control it, like what we've seen, what I mentioned with the recording industry after a particular song involving The Weeknd and Drake came out earlier this year, she's decided that I want to try to promote a sense of community and openness that this technology can facilitate, if it's not being used, to dominate other people and let people use my voice. And so we're going to go do that right now. What she says here is, in stepping in front of a complicated issue, we think we have found a way to allow people to perform through my voice, reduce confusion by establishing official approval, and invite everyone to benefit from the proceeds generated from its use. Now, the final clause there is like, we're going to use it, we don't get royalties or anything, but she's established in the spirit of things like a Creative Commons license, or open source technology, or open source access to particular software developments. She's like, I'm comfortable having this AI model be out there, use it for what you want. So, like I said, let's do it. So it's called Holly Plus. That's a stylized picture of Holly Herndon with the little logo for Holly Plus. And what you can do is you can go to this website, holly.plus, and you can take an audio file. We're going to transform this. This is a excerpt from a recording of a piece by the 17th century composer Johannes Kapsberger. He was a very prolific lute and fretted string instrument composer in 17th century Europe. So let's listen to the original. This is a recording by lutenist Paul Odette of the beginning, the first 30 seconds or so of a piece called Toccata Arpeggiata by Kapsberger. Okay, so we're going to take that file. You can see here it says supports audio files only. So you can go home after this and you can do the same thing that we're about to do with any audio file on your computer. And it's done. Now we're going to download that. And let's listen to it. So there we go. It's very easy to use. It's very fast. It's obviously quite limited. Go back to and what it can do. But I think there's what's important to understand about this is essentially the same technology that whoever made the vocal deepfake, The Weeknd Freddie Mercury, How Great Thou Art that we listened to used. Essentially the same, some kind of machine learning trained vocal model. But the person who's creating this is like, instead of trying to create a specific musical object that is going to achieve some sort of specific thing by, I guess, inspiring people to listen to it over and over, what Holly Herndon is like, I'm going to give you the tool, and then I want to see what you come up with it. And so she's, unlike a large unlike the entities that control ChatGPT, or even the University of Michigan, which has its own version, UMGPT, or Google with its Music LM project, or its other AI endeavors like Sing Song is something where you can put in an audio file and it automatically generates an accompaniment and that sort of thing. Those are really trying to control the user and streamline a particular activity towards a certain end that benefits them as an institution. Holly Herndon's not concerned about that. You can detect a bit of resistance to that paradigm because she's like, I'm giving you this tool, do whatever you want. We are sharing in this. And I think that's an interesting point of view. The other thing is you need that much engagement with it to find what it might succeed at. And I think that the only person who would spend a lot of time with this is somebody who is genuinely trying to squeeze out of this strange piece of software a really musically meaningful outcome, which I don't think is the goal of these larger things. I think the goal of the larger things is to get people to use them a lot, and that's about it. Which I don't think Holly Herndon cares about, because she is like, I'm putting this out here, anyone can use it however you want. Similarly is this, or similar in that open source vein is this program we're going to experience now, but not creatively, we're going to listen to it. It's called Rave. It was developed in 2021 by the person responsible for the first quote here, Antoine Caillon. He developed this at IRCAM, the institute in France that I mentioned earlier. Rave is a very powerful machine learning synthesis program that is very capable of accurately replicating sounds that are put into it with very little sample size. And what's great about it is it was released on GitHub as an open source tool. And the idea is that instead of being highly extractive, it's supposed to use a small sample size, so like a single performer could record themselves a couple hours of audio and use this to create an AI model of their performance. And we're going to see an example of that. The other two quotes, Jen Wong is a vocalist who performed a piece using this technology. She created the training materials for Rave for the performance we're going to listen to a clip from. She sang and talked for 3 hours and then gave it to her collaborator, Isaac Io Schenkler, who then put that into Rave. It modeled her voice, and then they used it in the performance. This kind of technology, the machine learning modeled performance synthesis, is an example of analysis and synthesis, to go back to our 4 categories. Rave, the How Great Thou Art, not interactive, obviously, because it was put together and put out there. Holly Herndon, I guess it's interactive because anyone can use it, but you can't, it creates an audio file and then you have the audio file. What's really interesting about Rave is that it is compatible with other commonly used software for live electronic performance. So still technical, something that specialists use, but you can manipulate it in real time, which is a pretty big development with this kind of tool. I think you will find that sonically it is sort of similar to Holly Plus because it has a lot of unpredictable outcomes. But in this particular application, in this piece, that's what Isaac and Jen wanted. And so what's interesting with these, we've seen 3 examples of the same kind of tool. A machine learning program that is used to model a vocal performance, and then the output is used creatively in some way. We didn't find a creative use for what we made with Holly Plus, but maybe I will later. The How Great Thou Art is meant to sound realistic. Something we did not talk about is how it doesn't really sound that realistic because the technology is not there yet. With Rave and the performance that we're about to see of a work, or listen to rather, of a work from the 1970s by a composer named Alvin Lucier called The Duke of York, which they performed with these tools, they are using the unpredictable, unrealistic outputs expressively. And so you see this interesting contrast with how, as I said, if there were a machine learning generated AI vocal model of a dead opera singer, like Jesse Norman, who passed away not that long ago, a few years ago, the goal would be for it to sound exactly like her, which is very difficult to do, even with the best machine learning software right now. But the goal here is for it not to sound realistic. It's to augment what a human singer can do. And so the difference in aim subverts that dominating goal that we might see in like a more institutional, like larger industrial application of the technology. This is a picture of Jen Wang performing this piece, The Duke of York, with Isaac Schenkler, who is not seen in the photo, in January of this year in Los Angeles. This piece is for vocalist and originally a synthesizer performer. And the idea was for them to like find, it has a text score, so it's an experimental piece. It doesn't have any like written music notation. And so the idea is like find pieces of music that like are from your childhood or are connected to meaningful memories. What we're going to hear, we'll listen to a couple minutes of this movement where Jen performs the aria Nessun Dorma from the Puccini opera Turandot, and her vocal performance is surrounded by these, it's like sort of swarmed in a way by the AI model of her voice, and what they're trying to do in this particular movement especially is create a musical version of the haziness of memory. And so, again, they're using the limitations of the technology in a very intentional and expressive way. So let's listen to a couple minutes of this. Okay. I wanted to point out that when I talked to Isaac Schenkler for both Jen and Isaac appeared in my article on this topic for the New York Times, Isaac stressed that they were attracted to this particular software because it was open source, because it was compatible with other software that they were familiar with, but also because it used the small data set and allowed for this really more traditional, intimate collaboration between the two performers, were Jen and the software and how it was used in the performance setting. And that, again, is a very big, that's an enormous contrast with how things are used, how AI is used on a larger scale. And it's interesting to see, it is in so many ways very novel because of the sounds that it can produce and the way music interacts with these programs. But that practice of a composer, or in this case, composer accompanist with the AI and a vocalist working together to create something, and that's a very old way of making music. And so I think it's, to go back to the George E. Lewis quote, that sparked the idea of domination with the software and larger industrial applications trying to change the way people make music in order to fit the interests of these large institutions. I think it's really nice to see how Isaac and Jen found a new extension of a very old way of working together through this technology. So now we're going to listen to an example of George Lewis's music, which I have talked about already to a certain extent. This is his quote from the New York Times article, and what I think is very interesting about it is his observation that the current generation of AI music programs have been designed for a culturally specific way of thinking about music. Imagine if the culture favored improvisation. A lot of George's perspective on music comes from African American experimental musical traditions and Afrofuturism, and this is why Voyager, and then this from 1987, and the most recent iteration of it, which we will watch a video of in a moment, is so different from some of these other things, because it's something that it's not a fixed object where it can create a product for you to use in a situation, like in a particular situation like Holly Plus. It's a program that you have to turn on and connect to through performance, and in that way it subverts this industrial mindset of using AI to achieve like a line item in a budget or something like that. It's something that you have to experience through activity and interactivity, and it kind of resonates with the philosophy behind Holly Plus, even though Holly Plus is something that like makes a widget, i.e. that AI representation of what you put into it. Okay, so we're gonna watch this piece. Voyager was premiered in about a year ago. There's an interesting to me, connection between this piece and the next piece, which is by Robert Laidlaw, who I mentioned earlier. This institute, the Center for Practice, Research and Science in Music, PRISM, is sort of like the British version of IRCAM, which I've mentioned many times, the French institute. And Robert Laidlaw, before his fellowship at Oxford, was a student here. And so you can see some connections through, specific locus, specific places being sites of where this technology is accessible and then being used. The piece that we just listened to, Duke of York, even though it's very different because it's just a text score that you can perform in a lot of different ways, that was premiered at IRCAM. So there's a connection there too, and of course Rave was developed at IRCAM. So we're going to watch, this is a long piece, it's for chamber ensemble and Voyager, which is the newest iteration of this Voyager idea. The piano there, you see there's, you see that the piano doesn't have anyone playing it, the computer is playing the piano. In fact, this piece begins with the piano playing by itself for a few minutes, which I think is very interesting. Other similar technologies, like when I was doing more of the timeline, the continuator technology has to respond to a person, but this, and for the lack of a better phrase, has a mind of its own. AI experts really don't like you making brain and mind metaphors because the computers work very differently, and it's not sentient, but the piano is being performed by the computer. And I chose this particular section, which is a couple minutes long, because it's a duet between the flute here. The flute, it kind of looked like a bass flute for a moment. The flute, which is the woman in between, George Lewis at the computer, and this bass clarinetist, and the piano. So you'll get a good sense of like the interactivity between a soloist and then the piano. if we go back to the quote, I think you can see how a piece like this promotes a communal, communitarian performance, because the performers are being asked to do a lot of improvisation, and they're being asked to listen to the computer-controlled piano like it is one of them, even though it's a computer-controlled piano. And that is, like we've seen with some of these other experimental examples, challenging normative ways of music making, and definitely subverting, even within the field, the industry of classical music, how music making is normally done using artificial intelligence, because there's no real score in a commodifiable sense, and the practice of like rehearsing specifically notated music in order to put together with other people, that doesn't fit this kind of music making, because you have to have an established familiarity with what it feels like not just improvise with other people on stage, but a computer. And I think it's very, I think it's notable in that way. And it shows again, were AI powered in a different direction, its capacity to change behavior in some interesting directions. The final piece that we're going to listen to, and I'm going to talk about, I apologize for not copying the right quote, so I'm just going to skip ahead to this. I will paraphrase what Robert would have said. This is Robert Laidlow's Silicon. This was, you can see Prism up in the left-hand corner. He wrote this while finishing his PhD at Prism, which is the institute where the performance we just watched took place at the Royal Northern College of Music in the UK. One of the questions that so this piece is for the BBC Philharmonic Orchestra. It was premiered almost a year ago. And one of the questions he addressed with this piece is, what is the point of an orchestra when we have technology that can emulate it in almost every way? And so he uses different aspects of artificial intelligence technology to explore that question, and he basically uses all the different categories that I talked about earlier and have referred back to. So he uses music generation in a traditional sense, so like Iliac Suite or the harmonic algorithm. The first movement of this piece, it's in 3 movements. There's no electronic sound, but all of the music, all the notated music that the orchestra performs has been generated by a computer, and Robert has put it together. So what he did is he put scores, digital versions of scores by himself, and then 18th and 19th century classical composers, an enormous body of music. He put it through a computer, machine learning program, and it constructed an orchestra piece off of that. And then he gave it to the orchestra to play. This piece is like 43 minutes long, so I was like, well, we can't listen to the whole thing, but we're going to listen to the last movement, 5 minutes from the last movement. The second movement uses an instrument, an AI-powered instrument, which is similar to the hyper instrument that I mentioned earlier. It listens to the orchestra, and so the sound of the pianist where the orchestra plays it, it's like housed in a keyboard. But it is listening to the orchestra, mimicking it, and also changing the timbre, the sound that it has throughout the performance. It kind of has, to use that phrase that AI experts wouldn't want me to use, a mind of its own. So we get a little bit of interactivity. I'll say that the last piece, Voyager, is like, as far as I'm aware, the apex of interactivity with AI. There's not as much interactivity in this piece, and I think one reason for that is because it's a piece for orchestra and not a piece for an ensemble of improvisers. Orchestras are very orderly, and I'm not surprised that interactivity was not, that Robert did not embrace interactivity, although, as I mentioned, George Lewis has essentially done this same piece that we just listened to with an orchestra before. That's the sound synthesis component in the second movement. And then there's analysis, so the machine learning involves analysis. The first movement with the procedure, the generated notated music, that involved a lot of analysis. And the final movement, which is what we're going to listen to, does as well. It also uses machine learning to produce sound and also do analysis. So like I said, this piece was written for the BBC Philharmonic Orchestra, and which is one of the many BBC orchestras in the UK. And what Robert did is he had access to like thousands of hours of old BBC orchestra, BBC Philharmonic broadcasts. And so he took all of that audio and he put it through a machine learning program to generate accompanying what we would refer to as fixed media audio in the field of music composition. So like what we got out of Holly Plus audio files that sound with the orchestra. And so there's an interesting arc to the piece where in the first movement we don't hear any electronic sound. The AI presence is kind of hidden because it's all in the scores that the orchestra is playing. And then in the second movement there's this singular AI voice that is kind of blending in and opposing the orchestra. And in this final movement, they come together. And not only do they play together, as we'll hear, the orchestra writing makes a lot of space for this AI-generated sound, which is based on these old orchestral performances and radio broadcasts. So you'll hear what sounds like voices of radio announcers, but saying gibberish. And you'll also hear orchestral sounds. And it gets difficult to tell what is coming from the orchestra on stage and what is coming from the electronic audio. And I think that's a really interesting and powerful way to close this piece, because it goes to this sort of new orchestra entity facilitated by AI. So we're gonna watch one more clip, which is about 5 minutes long, so you can kind of hear a wide range of what he was able to do with the synthesized machine learning sound, and then that's it. And so if anyone has questions, I can take questions, and otherwise we'll be done. So here is this excerpt from the third and final movement of Silicon, or I think Silicon or Silicon, if you're from the UK, by Robert Laidlaw. You can find this piece on YouTube if you want to watch the whole thing. It's a really cool piece. I think not only does Robert have a really interesting concept for the work, but his musical sensibilities are really great, I think so. Well, thank you all so much. And if anyone has a question, I will happily take your questions. No? Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Everyone watching live, watching in the future, and everyone here. Thank you for being here. And I hope that you go play around with Holly Plus when you get home. So, thank you.